Yo, this is your end of the year audit, so how good your year was. This is basically like the personal version of Spotify Wrapped, except instead of showing you what songs you played, it shows you what patterns you lived. It's basically like a breakdown of what made your year, right? So like how many new experiences did you have? How stable or unstable did your life feel? How present were you? How did you manage stress? How did you interact with people? What parts of your life do you feel like grew or shrunk this year? So how do you use this video? You don't have to like journal or write anything down unless you really want to. If you do, then obviously go for it. You don't need to like score anything. Basically just watch or like listen to the video, and like after each topic or category, just have a brief think of like how it reflected your year. And maybe if you really want to take notes and like take a couple notes, pay attention to like which categories specifically felt the most familiar or accurate or like filled you with existential dread. I don't fucking know, but those are probably the ones that influence your year the most. The goal here isn't really to decide whether you had like a good year or like a bad year. You're basically just taking a clearer look at what made your year. You guys fucking like these. You like Spotify. Like it's just basically your year wrapped, okay? And obviously also because it's my fucking video, so I can give you like a little category of yourself at the end, because that's what you all watch this channel for anyway. Also, if you want, I made a text version of this video with like all of the prompts and the categories included here. So if you want to print it off to do some journaling or just have like a text copy for easy reference, and you can get that on my shop. The link is up there and also in the description. Okay, so starting with category one. Category one is time allocation. So this part is basically like about the general shape of your days. So like how you spent your hours, what kind of environments were you in, and like how much intention or passivity filled your routine this year. So the first prompt to like think about is like how much time this year did you spend outside of your house? So like start by thinking about whether you spent most of your waking hours inside your house or like outside of it. If the majority of your time or like your days happened indoors, and that usually means that your world stayed pretty contained and pretty internal, right? It might mean that this year was a year where things felt repetitive for you, or maybe predictable, or maybe you were just like saving energy or like saving resources. But if you were outside more often this year in comparison to maybe you in the past, then you should also think about the nature of the hours that you spent outdoors, right? So here it's about quality over quantity, right? So like when you were not at home, right? Like when you were outside, were you outside because you were actually living your life there and doing things that were enjoyable to you, or were you outside a lot, but like almost all of those reasons were you being at work or like you being at school or like something that you don't actually want to do? So it might be something like commuting or running errands or doing like other mandatory things that require you to be outside. So the quality of the time you spent outdoors matters here, right? So like for example, 2 hours outside doing something that feels good to you or like feels real to you can maybe add more texture to your entire year than like 10 hours a day spent outside on like in transit or like sitting at an office job doing a job that you're not that interested in, right? And a follow-up topic from that is look at your focus time versus your fragmented time throughout this year. So what I mean here is like think about how many hours you genuinely spent focusing on something without like multitasking or like jumping between tabs or like apps or like tasks. So fragmented time here, basically what I mean by fragmented time here is like time where you were technically like air quotes you were busy for many hours, but like none of the hours were actually continuously busy or like it was like deep work, you know? So it might look like something like, oh, I opened a document and I wrote one sentence and then I fucking checked my phone for half an hour. Or it could be something like watching a video while replying to messages while also like half eating something. So like doing a bunch of like little things at once. It might be something like switching between 5 different tabs because you can't settle on what you were doing or like what you were watching. Or like reading something, stopping to check your phone, or like trying to relax but like also checking your phone. So like basically how much time, like how many hours this year do you think you had like the feeling of like I spent the whole afternoon doing shit, or like I think I was doing shit all day, but like I can't actually point to anything that I actually finished or remembered. So if this was your default mode for a lot of your days this year, then your year might end up feeling a little scattered or unfocused without you necessarily being able to point to a clear reason why. But the flip side of that is if you even had like a handful of hours where you were fully absorbed in something, so it could be work, it could be a hobby, or like it could even just be a conversation with someone else, it could be on the phone in person, but you were like focused, then that often shows up as feeling more stable or having more clarity in how your year went. Okay, and the follow-up to that is think about the amount of hours this year that you lost scrolling on your phone, So everyone scrolls, right? I'm a YouTuber, so you know, but also think about the general trend, right? Like did scrolling fill in little gaps in your day, or did it actually take over like entire sections of your fucking day. Like if you often found yourself in the day, like if you just look up and you suddenly like become conscious and like realize you lost huge chunks of time without meaning to, or you felt like holy shit, I just fucking time traveled, that probably says something about how your days might blend together, or it feels like time got away from you. And then moving on from that, the next thing you think about is like how many hours actually stood out to you throughout the year. So like the hours that you remember clearly, like you consciously remember what you were doing. So here, don't think about like photos that you took, right? Like not like things on like where you have like evidence that it happened. Like think about actual memories themselves. So like was there a specific conversation or like a moment or a walk or like an image where something felt different, right? So if only a few moments come to mind, then that might say something about like the overall sameness or the speed of your year, right? But on the other hand, if even like a handful of days or experiences stand out quite vividly, then that usually means that your year at least had some peaks, right? Even if the baseline was otherwise quite quiet. Also think about who you were with when you were having these moments, right? So like for example, were you alone? Were you with someone? So if your time was mostly spent inside or under artificial lighting or like in fragmented attention, and like maybe you were just doom scrolling the day away, then your year probably settled into like a pretty routine heavy low variation pattern. But on the other hand, if you regularly went outside or you engaged deeply with tasks or people, or you had at least like a few moments that genuinely stayed with you or felt true to you, then maybe your year had more texture, or at least had you felt more present in your year. And then as I said previously, think about like the quality of the time that you spent outside of your house, right? So like if your outside hours were long, like you spent a lot of time outdoors, but it was mostly filled with like errands or like work or like shit that you don't really want to do, then the quantity might be high, but like the emotional impact throughout the year might still be low, right? Which creates like a very specific kind of year where it was busy, but it might not necessarily feel the most fulfilling. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, so long as you actually have like a wider goal or reason you're pushing for and you know what it is that you're actually working for. But on the other hand, if you spent like maybe less hours in total outdoors, but they were filled with more things that actually mattered to you, then your year might feel maybe like smaller in scale, but that scale might actually still be like richer in tone and texture. Okay, so moving on to the next category. So the second category is about social and relationship presence. So this part is basically like, it talks about like the actual texture of the interactions that you had with other people this year, right? So like how connected were you to these people, and like how much energy did these connections give or take from you, and how did your general social habits look in real time this year? Okay, so the first thing to consider here is how many conversations this year did you have that like actually, looking back, like you actually know, you remember what you were talking about and they actually made an impact on you, or like it's a conversation that you can replay or like actually stayed with you. So start by thinking about like discussions that you remember clearly, right? So these tend to be moments where you feel truly engaged, or something about the interaction otherwise felt quite meaningful or important to you. So if you can only think of like one or two across the entire year, then that might say something about how present you felt socially or in the world, even if you spoke to a lot of people very often. So a lot of this is about like the depth of the conversations themselves and not necessarily how frequently you had them. And next, think about like the general emotional direction of the people that you spent time with. So like think about people that took up the most space in your day-to-day life, right? And whether or not when you spend time with these people, whether you feel lighter, you feel heavier, you feel calmer or more stressed after seeing these people. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a drastic change. Even subtle patterns can matter here. So like if you, for example, get off the phone with someone and you find that you're just slightly agitated or annoyed, versus if you get off the phone and you find that you're smiling. So if most of the people you saw this year regularly drained you or made you get into like, you know, like get into like a state, then your year probably felt pretty socially tiring. Versus if people gave you a sense of ease, then your year probably had at least little pockets of calm and stability and warmth, which is nice and good. You should also think about like how often you accepted or declined invitations to stuff. So a lot of people are going to be in the fucking comments now being like, but I'm introverted. Okay, I know it's going to happen. I know you fucking are. That's why you're watching the channel, right? That's fine. But also I think it's important to notice where you tended to engage with your social life, or whether you stepped back out of habit, and whether or not you're actually making active choices when you decline or accept something, rather than defaulting to like, oh, I don't go to things. I'm a fucking introvert. Like I'm an extrovert, rather than like actually thinking about like, oh wait, do I actually want to like can go to this thing. Maybe it sounds fun. Maybe it sounds terrible. I don't want to go. So if you reflect and you realize, oh, actually, Crystal, I was declining things because it just felt like it seemed simpler to stay home, even when you actually wanted connection, or if the thing seemed interesting, then that might speak to the tone of your year, right? Versus if you said yes more often or you tried new things, then that usually shows a year where you felt a little more receptive or a little more open to different social interactions. And then follow up from that, think about like during those interactions with other people, whether you were actually connected or like if you were self-monitoring yourself to some extent during those interactions. So what I mean by self-monitoring here is like it's times when like you're mentally watching yourself talk, or like you're checking your tone and you're worrying about how the other person is perceiving you in the conversation, or like worrying how you're coming across, or like rehearsing what you're going to say next instead of actually listening to the other person. Because if you're actually like having a connection or like having a nice interaction with this person, then you should, in theory, you should be like forgetting about yourself for a moment, right? Because you're actually absorbed in like what's happening, and like what the interaction should be happening organically without you having like a 4D meta awareness of like what you're doing. And then follow up from that, think about whether the interactions you had this year felt energizing or whether it was really effortful for you to have them. So just look at like the overall pattern you felt this year. So did talking to people usually feel enjoyable, or did it feel like a chore or just like another task that you just like had to do? So again, this is like a quality versus quantity thing. This often is probably going to be more revealing about your year versus the actual number of interactions you had. But also your response to this might not necessarily mean a bad thing. So for example, if you get tired easily after talking to people, maybe you do enjoy that person's company, but you just need time afterwards to recharge. That's me a lot. I get tired talking to other people easily. But in general, if your social moments this year were mostly you feel drained or distant, or just like generally it was like too much effort, then you probably had a year that was more disconnected or low engagement. Versus if you had some interactions where you felt present in the conversation, or it felt warm or memorable, even if they were rare, then those rare moments usually probably added some emotional texture to your year that kept the year from feeling too flat. By the way, me again, reminding you, I made a text version of this video with all of the prompts and categories included on here. So if you want to print it off and do some journaling, or like just have a text copy for easy reference, then you can get that on my shop. The link is up there and it's also in the description. Okay, moving on to the next category. So the next category is about emotional stability and recovery. So this is basically how you internally responded to things that were happening externally to you. So like when stuff happened around you, like disruptions or quiet periods, or when you had to make decisions under pressure, how did you recover or deal with the stuff that happened to you? So first, think about how emotional disruptions affected how you function this year, right? So like think about how many times something threw you off emotionally. So it might be like an argument or bad news, stress, uncertainty, you did something cringe or awkward, like anything that like shifted your mood or like focus in a noticeable way, or like made you lie awake in bed at night thinking about it. So like here, the content of like what actually happened doesn't really matter as much as like the impact that it had on you, right? So like don't think about what threw you off, just think about like how you reacted afterward to being thrown off. So for example, if distractions or like disruptions tended to like knock your entire day fully off course, like even in like small ways, that probably says something about how sensitive you felt throughout the year. And so from that, the next question is like, think about how long it took for you to feel steady again, or like recover after having these bad moments. So like maybe you bounce back within a few hours, or maybe like in a few moments you bounce back, or like maybe it took you the whole weekend, or maybe it took weeks sitting in the background without you noticing it was still there, or like you pretending that it wasn't bothering you anymore. So your recovery time here, or like how fast you bounce back after something disruptive happens, reveals whether your year had underlying emotional weight to it. And it's also like a good indicator of like how resilient or adaptive you felt this year. And then following on from that, think about like the decisions you had to make this year during heightened emotion. So these are like moments where you made a choice while you were overwhelmed or stressed out, annoyed, exhausted, basically like any decision you had to make in a not ideal or neutral headspace. So it might be like you ending something, or like starting something, avoiding something, oversharing. I've can do this one, cutting someone off, saying yes too quickly or no too quickly, or like just generally acting impulsively. So like think about if these moments happened often this year, then your year probably felt more reactive rather than you making calm, level-headed decisions. And then also think about periods of emotional flatness or emotional sameness that you had this year, right? So like think about stretches where nothing felt especially exciting or meaningful, or they didn't feel emotionally charged to you this year. This might not necessarily be like a bad thing or like a bad period in the year, but it is just like generally just means like the emotional tone stayed the same and nothing really moved you or affected you. Okay, so after thinking all of that, you can now consider like the overall pattern of the emotional regulation of your year. So like putting all of this together, right? Like think about whether or not your year felt emotionally steady or more varied or muted or volatile. So like think about if after you had something emotionally volatile happen to you, whether the feeling lingered or if you were able to bounce back quickly, or if something bad happened to you, whether you were able to communicate clearly. Either way, emotional dynamics definitely have a really big influence on the overall tone of your year. Okay, and the next category is about presence and awareness. So this category is basically like how available or like how present were you actually in your own life when it was happening, or like whether you were zoned out, metaphorically blacked out, and like working on autopilot. So the first thing you should think about here is like roughly how many hours of genuine presence do you think you had on an average day? So genuine presence here meaning moments where you weren't distracted or like split between tasks and you were actually like immersed in the experience or of whatever task that you were doing, right? So like when you were doing an activity and at the time you were doing it, you were actually properly trying to pay attention to the experience itself. So it might be like eating dinner and like not watching a video in the background, like just focusing on your meal, or like doing any activity without multitasking. Honestly, it can even be like if you're at the gym and you're not blasting music or like a podcast or watching some video while you're working out. This is gonna be a rare experience. Basically, I'm talking about like if you were raw dogging your gym workout, this one is moderately crazy, but maybe it's you, okay? So just like very loosely estimate how many hours per day were you actually present, or like you use a range if that's helpful. So like if you think you had very few of these hours in general, so like where most of your day was functional or you were doing stuff but you were basically really mentally checked out or you were like mentally empty, then that might mean that your year passed pretty quickly psychologically without leaving a lot of emotional footprint or memory. Okay, and then moving on, the next thing to think about is like, think about your level of sensory awareness this year. So this is a good quick test, right? So what I mean by this is like, think about how often you noticed texture or like temperature, lighting, sound, scenery, or like general atmosphere in your day-to-day life, right? So like often, this is gonna sound really preachy, but like oftentimes being present in your life isn't necessarily like a grandiose philosophical concept, right? It could literally be just as simple as noticing your physical surroundings. So like if you can remember the smell of a place you spent time in, or like the way the sky looked on a random walk, or like the proper taste of something you were eating because you actually thought about it or like ate it slowly, then that counts as being present, right? And if you can't actually recall specific moments like that, like, oh, I remember the specific taste of this sandwich that I had this moment, or like I remember I was sitting wherever and I remember eating it and I remember the texture of it, right? Like if you don't have random moments like that stood out to you, then that might indicate that your attention this year was mostly internal or distracted. And then from that, think about also how many days in the year felt like you were on autopilot, right? So like autopilot here being days where like basically you wake up and you do whatever usual tasks you do, or like your routine, you scroll on your phone, you watch YouTube, you eat, you exist, and then suddenly you blink and you're like, holy shit, it's like nighttime again, right? It's similar to that feeling of, you know, when you're like reading something and you're reading and all the words in your head or whatever, but like when you get to the bottom of the page and you suddenly become conscious and you're like, wait, what the fuck is going on? Like I just read all of that, but I couldn't tell you anything about it. Like think about how many of your days basically felt like that feeling. If this was your default state this year, or if this happened more often than not, then your year probably psychologically felt like it went by faster, or like it was more repetitive than it necessarily needed to be. Okay, and then the next two are kind of conjoined. So the first part is like, think about how many mornings you had where you got up without the feeling of heaviness or like feeling dread. So here, you don't actually have to count days where like you woke up feeling good, like excited or happy. It's like literally just like how many days did you wake up and you did not feel bad. So like you can just, if you woke up and you felt neutral, that counts. So like so long as you weren't weighed down. So here, like a year with more neutral or like nice, obviously you want nice mornings, like lighter mornings probably means that your year felt easier in hindsight versus if you think back and you're like, damn, I had a lot of days where like I woke up and I was like, I gotta do this shit again, guys. So like if you had that feeling a lot, then it might mean that your year left a heavier tone in general. Okay, and then moving on from that, think about like how many nights you spent where you didn't doom scroll or like stimulate yourself to sleep. So like how many nights you had where you didn't just fully gorge yourself on media or TV or like whatever stimulation until you like passed out from exhaustion, right? So like honestly, I was also bad at this one. This is probably like one of my worst ones on this list. If this was you a lot, then that probably means that there's some type of like maybe underlying dysregulation or stress or like feeling depleted this year versus if a lot of your nights were more where you went to bed intentionally or on time or where you felt like you were done for the day and you're like, I'm gonna go to bed, and you were calm. It can still be nights where you're watching TV or something, but if you were more intentional about it, right? So like if you finished watching a movie or like I'm gonna watch a few episodes of a show and then knowing when you're actively done and then going to bed, then there's more of a feeling of closure there. So overall for this category, like presence here is made up of small moments, right? So it could be like a small detail you noticed or like a thought you had while walking. It could be like a 5-minute conversation with someone that was just meaningful enough for you to remember. Those all count. If you didn't have many of those moments, then your year might feel like it just kind of zoomed by. And remember, if you're in your mid-20s, just remember psychologically time will only ever speed up from here because every year that you're alive becomes a smaller percentage of your entire lifespan. So your brain interprets it as shorter, and that trend never fucking reverses. Time only ever speeds up from here, and the only thing you can do to stop this is novelty, meaning new environments, new people, experiences, emotional context. Basically, you need like novelty where like your brain has to actually wake up and like be conscious and like process something new instead of like autopiloting through it. Otherwise, all of your years will start to like blend or like flatten into each other until it feels like you blinked and like 5 years pass and you have like no idea what the fuck is happening inside of them. Not to scare you. Just something to think about, you know, or ignore, which might just make the fucking actual issue worse, unless you choose to never think about it. Whatever helps you sleep at night, you know? Okay, moving on to the next category, which is effort versus avoidance. Okay, so this section is basically how much of your year was shaped by actual decisions versus how much of your year happened because you didn't want to feel uncomfortable or like overwhelmed, or like if you made decisions because you were tired. So first think about like how often you actually followed through on something when you intended to do something. So it can literally just be basic tasks that you meant to do, like day-to-day things. So like, did you handle things when they needed handling? Or like did you hang around until you were like forced into urgency or like from an impending deadline, right? So you already know what I'm going to say about this one, but like following through on things at the pace you originally planned creates like a stable rhythm in your life versus letting them pile up in the background, which is probably creating invisible stress that's like running quietly in your life all the time, or not in the background even, like in the fucking foreground, frankly, because of how long you put it off, which leads to the second part, which is think about like how many things you've delayed until they've become like actual problems, right? So like how often did you let things drag on until it became super stressful? I am also bad at this. I did this more than once this year, but like if you tended to let things sit until consequences showed up, so it could be something like an overdue form or like bills that you knew existed but you ignored them, or like emails that you avoided, then that reveals how much of your year was shaped by just you avoiding stuff. And if you did that a lot, where you avoided stuff a lot, it's likely that actually is just taking a mental bandwidth anyway, because every day you get up and you're like, I didn't fucking do the thing. I didn't do the thing. And so actually overall it takes up like more energy than if you just did it at the beginning. And then moving on from that, think about how many small voluntary risks you took this year. So the risks here don't necessarily need to be dramatic. They can be like little tiny risks. So it could include sending a message to someone first, or like walking into a new place alone for the first time, or like having a sincere moment with someone, maybe your parents, trying something that you weren't sure you'd be good at. Any of those like tiny small moments will expand the shape of your year more than anything. anything else. And then the next thing to think about is like, think about the ways in which you interrupted yourself this year when something felt uncomfortable. So like what I mean by this is, you know, those moments where like if you're about to do something that's like slightly effortful and then suddenly your brain invents a different task so you can avoid what you originally meant to do, right? So like if you're about to answer an email and suddenly you're like, oh wait, let me fucking like deep clean, reorganize my bookshelf right now. Or like if you're about to start working and so you like open TikTok for 1 minute and then like that 1 minute becomes half an hour. So overall for this category, just think about like whether avoidance was a dominant driver or a motivator for you this year, right? If so, then your year probably leaned away from direction and active choices that you were making and probably leaned toward more reactive or passive behavior. Versus if you occasionally did something small or like a little bit uncomfortable on purpose, or like if you were able to just follow through on shit that you were gonna do when you plan to do it, then you probably had like a stronger sense of agency this year. Okay, and then the next category is about self-development. So this part is about like what genuinely improved your life this year, right? So like think about areas where your skills clearly got better. So it can be anything where you now are objectively more capable at the thing than you at the start of the year. So this can be like a skill like cooking or writing, lifting weights, or it can be like a soft skill like, oh, I speak more confidently now, or I manage my own habits better now. I eat more regular hours. It can be something like that, right? Like literally any area in your life where you can see an actual difference in like external or internal results, that all counts. And then moving on from that, think about new experiences you had intentionally this year or that you approach intentionally. So it can be moments where you're doing something unfamiliar. So it could be learning a new tool, trying a new hobby, taking a class, going somewhere alone. Anything where you're like arguably participating in the thing versus spectating or like watching other people do the thing. But obviously, new experiences is only one area of self-development, right? Because the other aspect is routine and consistency. So now think about routines that you maintained long enough for them to like genuinely have an impact on you this year, right? So like the routine here doesn't need to be perfectly executed, but it can be anything you did often enough. Like it needs to be like you need to do it regularly enough that you actually felt impact. So for example, it could be you exercise consistently enough this year to like actually feel physically different. Or you're trying to grow on social media and you posted enough times this year to like either actually grow your following, or it could literally be like you posted enough this year to like improve how comfortable you feel speaking on camera, you know? Or it could be something like, oh, I studied regularly enough to like feel more familiar and knowledgeable about a subject this year. It can honestly even be something like, oh, I scheduled in enough breaks this year where you're able to like sustain yourself without burning out, right? This one is actually fucking useful for me actually. Even though it's fucking cringe to call yourself one of those people. It's true, actually. So again, consistency here. If the routine dissolved almost instantly or like once the novelty wore off, then it doesn't fucking count. I'm sorry. The goal is to have it be consistent enough that you felt impact. Otherwise, it didn't really shape your year. And then think about things that you actually finished this year, right? So like finishing even small things. So maybe completing a short essay or getting a certification or even like successfully decluttering your house. That all contributes to your sense of progression this year. And then consider how many times you learned something this year, but like specifically where you learned something due to you being curious about whatever it is that you were learning rather than you being obligated to learn it. So what I mean by this is like think about times where you maybe read something or you researched something or like you practiced or you tried something because you actually were curious about it and you actually wanted to understand it. So for example, if you were like reading a paper but you had to do it for a class, but otherwise you wouldn't have done it because you thought it was boring, or like if you had to learn something for a job but otherwise you didn't have the desire to do it, then that doesn't count. So if you can think of any actual instances this year where you actually wanted to learn something because you actually wanted to, so it could be like baking, or like I watched a 4-hour video on YouTube about like a niche topic, right? That counts. And in my opinion, I didn't fucking fact check this because why? I didn't fact check this, but like it makes like common sense to me. I think I'm right. I think that like curiosity based learning probably tends to stay with you longer, and that is probably what actually shifts the way you think and how you see the world. Okay, and then now think about or list out actions you took this year that actually changed your life in some way. So it could be in the aspect of your career or your love life or just basically any aspect of your life and its direction in any way. And you might not notice this until later. It can be something like applying for a different kind of role or like publishing or posting something publicly. Maybe it's something like ending a dynamic that wasn't right for you anymore. So it could be a friend, it could be a lover, it could be something else. Maybe you move to a different city or like even maybe you just fucking change like what coffee shop you do your homework in. Maybe you like started a personal project. Maybe you invested in stocks, or like your health or whatever. Insert aphorism, motivational quote. Anyway, the point is small directional changes here add up, right? And they can alter the trajectory of your entire year. So considering all the aspects for this category, if you found that most of your energy this year went into planning or like preparing or setting things up without you actually carrying through on those plans, then the year might actually be less about actual development and more about exploring, which is fine. But caveat to that is like, if you're being honest with yourself, it could be about exploring, but it could also just potentially be you postponing. Only you will actually know which one it is. But if even a few things reach like a noticeable point of you improving or completing them, then it probably means that you did develop this year in some way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the final category, and this is about external conditions. So this talks about like the events this year which happened, which were out of your control. So everyone has some years where something happens and it wasn't due to your personal choice, or maybe it's not something that you would have wanted or intended to happen. And so obviously, if that happened to you, you have to factor that in, because it's not fair to have an entire assessment of your year if maybe you were at a disadvantage this year, which wasn't your fault. So think about the actual size of any external events that happened to you this year. So some years that might be really big, unavoidable events that deeply impact your life. So it might be something like family illness or a major financial shift or you losing your job or having to move unexpectedly. Anything that basically affects your basic stability. The events themselves don't need to be dramatic. If it's anything that changed how you live day to day, then that counts. So after thinking about that, think about how much of your energy this year or how much of your resources got redirected because of those events. So think about how much you spent your energy or your time having to react or accommodate or like adjust or manage something that was out of your control, or like something that you didn't want to happen, but now you're stuck with it and you have to deal with it. And then with that, think about how long that instability after the external event lasted. So obviously here, life disruptions will differ in how long they last and also how quickly you recover, right? So like maybe you bounce back right away, or like maybe this messes up your life for like a few months, right? And like the duration here obviously matters in like the obvious sense of like if the disruption lasted longer, then it affected a larger portion of your life this year. But also in the sense that like if something was like fucking with you for half a year, it doesn't just affect your mood. You probably had to restructure your priorities or how you behaved, so it can have a huge effect on your daily life and also other aspects of your year. So taking into account external events, now think about how much the other metrics or categories that I mentioned in this video even apply to you. So as you watch this video, right, when you think about the rest of these categories, think about whether they even make sense for your situation this year. Because if you had a lot of external events or things that happened to you, it's completely likely that maybe this year you just didn't have the space for growth or development or being fully present or being productive. Sometimes the year might just be about managing something difficult or unexpected, and if that applies to you, then maybe for you the only realistic success metric this year was getting through the year and also being resilient enough and keeping your life stable enough to move into the next year without more loss or disruption. So if this year felt more like just being resilient, then the next metric might apply to you, and that's think about like how much effort it required for you to just maintain basic functioning this year. So like if just doing basic tasks or communicating or taking care of yourself on a fundamental level, like handling basic finances, if doing all of that felt like it took more effort than usual, then maybe external events out of your control shaped your year more than your own choices did. And through that, finally think about how much agency you had or how much agency existed within your year. So what I mean by this is like think about how many decisions this year were made because you wanted to make them versus how many decisions did you make this year because circumstances pushed them onto you. So some years, if you have the opportunity to, they're about creating new things or choosing new directions about your own life and exercising your agency, right? But other years are more out of your control and they might just be about about maintaining what already exists and keeping things stable because there isn't room for anything else. So if most of your decisions were affected by external forces this year, then this likely was a pretty constrained year for you, which might not be good if you're wanting to develop or progress or become some ideal version of yourself. But the upside is that this year probably revealed something about how resilient you are and how much you can withstand, and that's also important and an achievement in itself. Okay, so that wraps up all of the categories and items for this video. So you should now have like a general sense of what actually shaped your year. I'm not going to go through like a few profiles for what your year was. So look back or like reflect on like the answers or thoughts that you had while watching this video. Identify the patterns, the biggest things, see which of the following profiles fits your years the best. I'm going to set out all the names for you first and then tell you about each one in detail. So there are 5 possible year profiles that you might fall into. So the 5 types are number 1, stable, number 2, chaotic, number 3, dormant, number 4, transitional, and number 5, constrained. So I'm going to go through each of these, right? So like as you listen, think about which of these fits your year the most, which sounds like the dynamics or patterns that occurred during your year, and then obviously also can let me know in the comments. So starting with a stable year. So if you got a stable year, this is like a year where life moved at a steady, consistent pace, right? So your routines held together, your energy stayed relatively consistent, and generally your environment was also pretty stable in the sense that it was a stable environment for you, even if the physical location changes, if that makes sense. Basically, it's a year where like nothing major disrupted your plans for huge stretches of time this year, right? So you were probably present in a pretty predictable way in the sense that you showed up to most things, you were pretty good at like following through and kept life functional without dramatic swings of like up and down mood swings or like emotional swings. So depending on other factors, this might not necessarily be the most exciting year, but the upside here is that in hindsight, you might feel grounded and safe this year, which is obviously also a necessary and important and good thing to have. These types of years often set the foundation for more ambitious years later on. Okay, and then moving on to the next profile, we have the chaotic year. So a chaotic year is basically a year which is characterized by like movement or like fluctuation or volatility or like unpredictable big shifts, right? So like maybe this year your plans change really quickly, or like maybe you didn't keep a consistent routine, or like just like generally like shit in your life or like events were just jumping around. It felt maybe more extreme in comparison to years you've had in the past. So the extremes here can be like good or bad, right? So like maybe some months felt productive or meaningful while others just collapsed entirely. Again, chaotic years aren't necessarily negative. It just meant that your year probably lacked continuity. So maybe it's harder to put a pin on how exactly to describe your year. So this might be you if when you look back on this year, it felt exciting or volatile or like overwhelming, depending on how much of that actual movement you personally wanted. It probably left you with like a lot of memories and stories, or at least like some moments that stood out clearly, even if you're not really sure what the overall arc of the year is. That's okay. The defining quality here is basically like motion and like movement, and like that can obviously exist with or without continuity or structure or like meaning, like if you don't understand what's going on. And then moving on to the next profile, we have the dormant year. So a dormant year is like a year where not a lot of things changed in a meaningful way. So maybe there wasn't much novelty this year, or like maybe you didn't have many memorable events, or like there wasn't a lot of like new emotional texture in your life. So your days likely blended together, which on the one hand, maybe it's nice in terms of it was consistent, but on the other hand, it might have been uneventful or too quiet. So dormant years might often feel like lost time, again, because the days might have blurred together. It depends honestly on like your baseline of the year. The upside is maybe that it preserved your energy and your stability, and that can make it a transitional year for you, even if you don't realize it. But obviously, the key thing to remember here is that a dormant year only is transitional in the sense if something eventually moves, i.e. if you eventually make something happen, right? So like if you repeat this kind of year enough times where like you're too passive or like the days blur together, then that just becomes your life, man, right? And that's inaction, and it's not actually you making life happen, but it's life happening to you. That sounds lame as that is fucking cheesy, but it's true. Dormancy might be neutral in the moment, but it can also become directionlessness. And then moving on, we have the transitional year. So a transitional year is basically a year where something big shifted, or like many big things shifted. So it can be like an internal shift, an external shift, maybe both. Maybe you changed direction, maybe you ended something, you started something, you moved, you changed goals, you ended a relationship, you let go of something that meant a lot to you in the past. So the defining feature of a transitional year is that you can see a before and an after for this year. So when you compare the start of this year versus the end, and how you navigated the year can vary. Maybe you felt really good throughout the year. Maybe you felt like shit. Most likely, you probably felt something in the middle, or it was like confusing, but it'll make sense later on. So for me personally, if I was reflecting on this year, I know for sure that I had a transitional year. Okay, and then moving on to the final profile, we have a constrained year. So a constrained year is basically the type of year where like you didn't really get to fully shape it. So it might be because there were lots of external circumstances this year that affected you, or it influenced your options and your schedule. So you might feel like you had a constrained year if you felt like your decisions were often reactive rather than you actively choosing to do them. So if this feels like you, sometimes constrained years are just about general survival. So surviving something difficult. It can be financial, emotional, medically, relationally, logistically. And if that's the case for you this year, these years can't really be judged by growth or change metrics, because if you're being honest, the only relevant evaluation here is that you made it through the year, right? And that should be your key success metric. A constrained year often doesn't produce visible progress right away, or like maybe you don't feel like you really grew a lot as a person this year, but the year might have just preserved what you would have otherwise lost, and that in itself is really important. It's already important. So that wraps up the last of the profiles, and that also wraps up your year. Yeah, this is how your year went. And just remember that regardless of how this year went, the only thing that has ever existed and will ever matter is what you do today and what you do tomorrow, right? And it's still December, so go celebrate, enjoy yourself and the festivities the way that everyone does at the end of the year, because remember that you in January, when the lights come back on and you're suddenly like, oh fucking shit, I gotta go to the gym, I gotta do all my fucking New Year's resolutions, okay, I gotta go get a job, I gotta get my life together immediately because I let myself go all over the holidays, right? You in December versus you in January, fucking disaster. I'm sure stacking those 2 months together back to back and how you act in them respectively is totally fine and sustainable for next year. But don't worry. Don't worry about that, okay? Do not think about that. That is totally fine. That is for you to think about on January 1st. But for now, just enjoy yourself, listen to music, get super fucking drunk, or if you're underage, don't get super drunk. But honestly, if you are like under 18, you really have no business watching some existential video about how your year went anyway, because you are a child and you don't need to measure it in metrics like that. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, then check out the rest of my channel. Obviously, some of like the self-help, air quotes self-help here is like more useful than others, but the only way to find out is to fucking subscribe, and please watch all the other videos.